Welcome to the Center in the City podcast. I'm your host, Wade Brill, and during this series, I'll be interviewing various thought leaders, wellness experts, and humans on how they practice sustainable self-care and mindfulness. We'll get real and raw, talk about the light and the shadow side of self-care and mindfulness, and how we can actually stay centered amid the chaos and the hustle and bustle of our modern day world. So settle in and get centered. This podcast episode is brought to you by Centered in the City, a virtual on-demand self-care and mindfulness platform with different meditations, journaling prompts, nourishing recipes, and Pilates flows, all designed to support you feeling calm, focused, and energized as you live your life in this modern day world. For more information, head on over to centeredinthecity.com and claim your 7-day free trial. Welcome back to the Centered in the City podcast. I am so glad you are here. Today on the podcast, I get to interview Iggy Perello, who is a leadership coach. She created WSL Leadership. Iggy is passionate about supporting people who have positions of influence build their emotional intelligence skills so that they can create better places, better work environments, better spaces for people and the world. I'm really excited to have Iggy on the podcast to talk about conflict management and restorative justice and how we can heighten our emotional intelligence skills to repair our relationships, because the world is so fraught with conflict in all of our different systems. And Iggy is going to inspire us with some insight and awareness of how we can start to approach conflict from, dare I say, a more centered place. Plus, Iggy just has such fun and light and bubbly, grounded energy that takes these heavy concepts and makes it more playful. So you will definitely laugh and smile as we talk about some serious shit. Let's settle in and let's get centered. Iggy, welcome to the Center in the City podcast.
Thanks, Wade. I'm excited to be here.
I want to begin by bringing back one of my famous questions of what does being centered mean to you?
Oh, this is a great question. I am a fan of wholeness over balance. I think balance is an unrealistic thing that people are like, well, how much garbage do I need to add to my life to like balance out the good stuff? Oh, wait, I have too much garbage. I need to suddenly to balance good stuff. It's a mess. Like, I don't think I have that much math capability for the amorphous pieces of the world we live in. So I think being centered means being accepting of the wholeness that we are, whether that's in terms of the work and the not work and the person we feel like we have to be at work and the person we feel like we can't be at work, perhaps. I guess I'm speaking more to the working environment is just on my mind for this conversation, but the same is true for the non-work, the non-work part of our life, which is our life, for example, and who we are with our family, our friends, who we are in those spaces are still our whole self, regardless of the pieces of our personality we have to bring forward or sort of, I don't know, not squash, because that sounds so kind of aggressive, but to hold back on, I guess. And embracing that sense of wholeness in whatever context it is, I think is what it means to be centered.
I love that, because how often I feel like there's just this permission to be our whole selves, knowing that certain parts of us will come out in our work situations, other parts of us will come out when we're around this friend group and that friend group or different environments. But how can we see ourselves as whole and complete just as we are without feeling like there's this mathematical equation, as you mentioned, as needing to constantly like have our finger on the pulse. And when you said the words wholeness, it was like I could even feel myself just be like, ah.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
And I think it takes off the pressure of being like, oh, am I being vulnerable enough in this situation? Like, that's just how vulnerable you feel like being. Am I being trusting enough in this situation? I work with these pieces of emotional intelligence that are very qualitative and very sort of intuitive in some ways, not like in a like, oh, the universe will tell me, but in a like, this feels right to me, or this feels appropriate for the amount of trust, the amount of respect, the amount of like how I'm reading the situation. And that's okay. You don't have to like spill your guts everywhere, and nor do you have to be a walled in little turtle in a shell everywhere. You can embrace those at times, absolutely. And there's no pressure to like balance them out in any given situation.
Yeah, so let's talk about, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast is to explore conflict resolution, which I think is a skill and a set of skills, let's say, that we all need and we all could benefit from learning more of or sharpening multiple times in our lives.
Nonstop.
Yeah. And, our world is full of conflict. And I live in a part of the world, actually, you do too, where Pacific Northwest, well, I guess part of the year you're in the Pacific Northwest, but that can typically be very passive aggressive. And I'm originally from New York City, a place that is known as being aggressive.
Just straight out aggressive, which is clear, right? It's so clear. You know what you're getting. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I have just noticed lots of conflict around even just being from different places, being from different cities, being from different cultures and communities. And so how easily conflict can happen in any part of our life, the work environment, coworkers, friendships, family members, right? Conflict is in the news, countries, right? Like conflict is around us. So it's like, can you share with us what even practicing conflict resolution, like what that means?
That's a great question. It means everything. It is a practice more than a destination for sure. And everywhere you go, you'll see tips and tools. Like on my website, like here's a guide, here's a this, here's, resources. But the basic part of conflict, and I would say conflict management over resolution, I don't think we can, I think the goal to resolve is like the goal to be in balance. Like, what does resolution mean and for who? And suddenly it's like competition and someone's right and someone's wrong. Like, I think in the terms of conflict management, it's more akin to relationship management. How do we manage this relationship that we're having right now in a way that everyone is thriving, or everyone is functional, or everyone is like making progress, or everyone is like still here with us, like whatever it is. There's sort of, it depends on so many different types of things. But I think the things that really matter are being able to communicate effectively and clearly, and specifically around unspoken expectations. And like basically those are the two things that cause conflict, either unspoken expectations or a sort of a miscommunication of some sort. Like, this thing matters to me and this thing doesn't seem to matter to you. Now we're kind of in a weird space about this thing. Or I wanted this thing to happen and it didn't happen, but I didn't really tell you that, but now it's not happening and now I'm acting weird to you, which is some classic food for passive aggressive behavior out there.
Yeah, or just even in alignment with the communication piece, a lot of the times we don't know what we're thinking, feeling, needing. So how can we communicate that clearly to somebody? And then we assume that they should get or should understand what we want or need or what's important, but then they don't.
Oh yeah,
because we haven't communicated and we blame it on the other person.
Oh yeah, we blame it on them, or we sometimes, depending on the space and all the things, we get into an emotional reaction spot. We get angry, we get frustrated, and then I'm just growling or yelling or making non-verbal noises, and someone else is like, what is even happening? I have this friend of mine who once told me about how she was really struggling with her boss, and her boss would interrupt her during meetings, and she was trying to, get her point across. And the boss, like, they're at a meeting, the boss interrupted her again, and she's like, so here's what I did. I'm like, what did you do? She's like, I said, ah, and I raised my hands, and like shook my hands in the air, and I was like, ah. I'm like, did that actually did that help? Like, that seems super unuseful to, and like her boss didn't know what she was doing, like, I'm like, maybe, perhaps you needed to tell your boss, like, hey, you're interrupting me. This is hard. Like, let's figure this out, versus I'm just going to yell and shake my hands next time this happens. Like, okay, weird. Yeah, some classic sort of miscommunication, but like emotion, right? She felt really frustrated. Like the sound, like just seeing her like kind of describe this, I'm like, yeah, that sounds frustrating, like maddening, just really angry, like she was being shut down, but also, there's a lot going on there. I'm like, cool. Yeah, emotional response is legit. And your actual like articulation of that probably didn't help in that moment. And maybe later it was like, hey, remember when I was yelling about that thing? Here's what was happening. Like maybe that's like a marker for the conversation, but in the moment, not probably effective.
Yeah. And we all have so many different strategies or patterns to try to get our needs met. And a lot of the time they're not, or they can not be helpful.
Oh yeah. Sure.
And there's a lot of like repatterning and reteaching of ourselves that we need to do to sharpen our communication. One of my communication teachers, Oren J. Sofer, talks about, communication, the intention of communication is to get our needs met, right? Is that we live in an interconnected world. And so we all need to learn how to work together to get our needs met. And sometimes people can't help us meet our needs. And that's where, a lot of self-soothing needs to happen, and where we get to practice kind of meeting our own needs, which is a whole other piece.
Right. Yeah.
And a whole other set of tools.
Whole other practice. Yeah, definitely.
But let's talk about conflict resolution. And you even have this beautiful term that you share on your website, and I know from other conversations, around restorative justice. So talk to us about, what does restorative justice mean? How is that similar or different from conflict management?
Restorative justice is actually this sort of global movement and practice that involves looking at conflict from the perspective of what harm was caused, and then how do we actually repair that harm, and with everyone involved in that conflict, in that situation. It, as a term, it's come under fire because it sounds like, oh, you're restoring something, you're fixing something. If you have a relationship that's kind of been damaged and then you fix the relationship, wait, aren't you just sort of patching up a garbage relationship to begin with? Like, that is sort of the critique of I would say a critique more of the words than of the actual practice itself, because the practice itself moves relationships forwards and evolves relationships in terms of how people are relating through this activity of actual repair. Like, someone was harmed, and I would say, in my experience, like the super boiled down, simplified version is, you're probably harmed in one of two ways that matter. You're harmed in terms of trust has been damaged, or you feel disrespected. And I think there are a lot of other harms out there, like, oh no, they stole my shoe. They, like whatever, like there's specific things, but underneath all of these different layers is usually this piece of trust or respect that needs to be repaired, versus like, oh, you stole my shoes, now you gave them back, we're fine, right? I'm like, we're sort of not, like if I work with you every day, you stole something from me, you gave it back, like we're not actually good here. Like, we need to do more repair. And that is a repair of trust and respect, often. Simplified. So how do you then engage in that repair with the people involved? And the sort of hallmark of restorative practice is the circle, where you have the people sitting together, like classically in a circle, usually a facilitator, someone to help make sure, keep the conversation moving and productive. And you get to this beautiful place of deep understanding of the harm that was caused. Like, oh, well, yeah, you stole my shoes, but, oh, you needed whatever. Like, there's maybe more to that story, right? And like, oh, you stole my shoes, and here's more to my side of the story, like how that impacted me. So the stories get heard on all sides, and then repair becomes something more interesting and deep around, like, well, I want to feel comfortable, whatever, putting my shoes in my locker at school or whatever, because I want to feel comfortable at school. So that's what's being harmed, is like my sense of feeling of safety in this space. How do we work together to fix that then? And it's super personal. It's super individualized. It's not, there's this classic, the world of the U.S. justice system is like blind justice, which you can't see my air fingery quotes, but like I always have to say blind justice with the air fingery quotes, because blind justice really is fundamentally oppressive, because the people with more resources always do better in blind justice situations than the people with less resources, whether that's lawyer, money, time, connections, whatever it is. So blind justice is a tool of oppression. Restorative justice, then, the word justice really means that how are we fixing the situation between these people in a way that this relationship is being repaired, and that these people can work together, be together, interact together, share in community together often at times. It's sort of, depending on the situation, in a way that is productive, healthy, and moves forward, versus someone was punished, someone else feels better, someone else feels bad. no one actually in the end feels as good or bad as they think they're going to feel. And we're all still on edge and nervous and suspicious and feel disrespected and distrust, lack of trust in the situation. So working on restorative justice means, yeah, those deeper levels of repair between people to build stronger relationships.
So, how do we, if we were to break this down, and maybe let's use a couple of examples, like a work situation, then maybe more of a familiar or a friend situation. What does it look like, or what are some of the steps that we can explore to create some restorative justice in our relationships where there's been rupture?
I'm trying to think of there's no easy examples, right? Let's say in a work situation, you have a coworker and you're working on a project together. Classically, this is also a fine example from the world of education. You're working on a project together. They're not doing their part, right? You're like, oh, I need to get this thing done, blah, blah, blah. This part's missing. Oh, wait, that's your job, your responsibility. So now you have this, you're like, well, can I trust this person? Like, they didn't do their part. I'm in conflict with them a little bit. And I would say not every conflict is like a fist fight brawl, right? Like, we are in trouble in this relationship if I don't trust you to do your part. Meanwhile, you might just be like, la la la, out there, have forgotten. So I think the steps are really in the beginning to understand what your expectations are. Those unspoken expectations need to be made clear to you, even as a person. Like, oh, I thought we both knew this was the deadline. Like, it was Friday. Like, I thought we both knew that, but maybe we didn't. I don't know. I thought we both knew what we were doing. I was doing part A, you were doing part B. Were we not clear on that? Maybe. I mean, so there's some clarity there that needs to happen. And I think there are some deeper levels of unspoken expectations too. And I think people, I don't know if you've met someone who's like, oh yeah, I'm a, like, if you're 5 minutes early, you're late kind of person. So blah, blah, blah. And you're like, well, I didn't know that. I showed up on time, and you're pissed because I'm on time and you thought I was late. Not, unspoken expectations. There's many classic versions of that. So getting clear with yourself on what is expected, getting clear with what needs or what harm has been caused. And like, harm also seems like this big grandiose thing. And yeah, trust is important. But the reality might be like, oh, we worked together a lot and I expected this thing done on Friday and it wasn't. I can probably just talk to you because I know you well, depending on what the relationship is that we have, right? And maybe this is a one-time thing, or maybe this happens all the time, right? Like, oh, this last week your thing wasn't done on time. 2 weeks before that, it was kind of done, but it was half done and crappy. 3 weeks before, like, there are like these pieces add up because relationship is like a thing that happens over time. There's not like a sort of a static snapshot that we can take. So recognizing that, understanding relationship, understanding the your expectations, your sense of the relationship, which really our sense of a relationship might not be shared with the other person, who's just like, yeah, I don't need, what was your name again? I'm just like here to like turn in this stuff on Fridays. Like, well, I don't know who you are even. Like, they may, whatever it is, you may have, all these things may be differently shared between people. And the sort of the next piece is to get to that clarifying point. Like, well, here's what I really need for myself. Like, I need to feel confident that this piece will be done. And there's like a little bit of the why that matters in here to ourselves. And maybe that why doesn't matter for the other person. Like, oh, I need to have everything done 5 minutes early because I need to feel, that makes me feel confident going into the situation and blah, blah, blah. Versus someone else who's like, yeah, I just wing it in the moment. And you're like, oh, freaking out, perhaps. So why that matters to me, what needs this meets me for me are all pieces I need to kind of cogitate on a little bit. And then to go into the confrontation with the person from a place of questions before I have judgments, and to ask, hey, do you have this thing? Is my perception of the situation even clear? Like, I thought this thing was gonna be done Friday. I don't see it. And they might be like, oh yeah, I put it in your mailbox instead of emailing you. And you're like, oh my gosh, like whatever, like clarify. Is my assessment of the situation clear? Are we seeing the same thing? Are we observing the same thing? And open that up from a place of dialogue, which is hard because we want to jump right to, dude, where was this thing? I can't believe it. It wasn't done. Oh my gosh, I'm freaking out. And you're like, not an easy conversation to engage with when someone brings you the energy of being unhappy, being, I think New Yorkers are actually more clear than aggressive, by the way, but like that, like super direct, that very direct piece of like, you said this was going to be here. It's not here, like super clear. And I'm a big fan of the Brene Brown quote that clear is kind, like just cut right to it, versus maybe the Northwest. Well, hey, this thing maybe was supposed to happen sometime. Like, are you sure? Like, do you think it was maybe important? And you're like, I don't even know what you're talking about anymore because there's so many like layers of maybe on there. Clear about what happened. Clear about what, like, clarify those expectations, and then learn. Like, this is like a learning conversation versus an accusing and fixing it conversation. So the learning needs to happen before the fixing, repair, next steps need to happen. And to really engage with that learning moment of, I need to figure out what's going on for you a little bit. You show up and you're like, oh, I didn't have that thing done. My cat had to go to the vet and there was emergency surgery and blah, blah. And you're like, cool. Like, suddenly I've learned something, or I forgot it, or that wasn't important to me, or, whatever it is. Like, the both sides matter in this conversation, because that's really what you're moving to resolve a little bit is, well, how do we make sure we're aligned in what matters to us and how we prioritize those things? Deadlines for me. And you're like, quality, quality, quality. I'm like, oh, the deadline didn't set you up to work to the quality you wanted. Maybe we need to figure out how we balance those things out and come together. So the conversation is curious before judgmental, and then learn, and then talk about, well, what should we do next? Like, how do we fix this in the moment, and or how do we not have this happen in the future? It just kind of depends on the thing a little bit. But separating those pieces out really helps. Like, so my self-learning, self-understanding, self-awareness, understanding of the situation, and how you feel about the situation matters as much as how I feel about it. You might be equally upset, but differently, or you might be like, I don't even care. Like, what is the big deal? All of that matters, right? Like, the whole range of emotion is a part of this. This other sneaky part that is what the situation says about to us, what we say about the situation to ourselves, about who we are as people. So me being like on time means like, oh, I'm a good person because I'm on time. You're a bad person because you're not on time. And if I come at it with that vibe and you're like, you're calling me a bad person, I'm just like, care about quality, like, get off my back. Suddenly it's a very defensive conversation again. So what we think about ourselves through these actions is this sort of undertone that we may actually have to address more overtly. Like, I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm just saying, where was this part of the project that I needed? Moving forward. So addressing sort of all those pieces together as before you move on to like, how do we fix this? How do we fix the future? That was a lot of words, but you got a bunch of steps in there.
I really appreciate you breaking it down, and obviously big brushstrokes, but it's very helpful to think about and contextualize all the different steps there are internally and externally to understand and pay attention to, as humans are very complicated animals, and how we collaborate and try to move things forward takes a lot of time and effort and delicacy. Yeah. Delicacy.
Diplomacy, all those things.
And one of the things, I mean, you mentioned a lot that I want to circle to. And one of the things that came up for me when you were talking about when you're collaborating with somebody that you've never maybe worked with before, or it's been a long time. Mike Michalowicz, in his new book called All In, talks about the personal operating manual for each person on his team, where it talks about their styles, like, oh, are they an innovator, an out-of-box thinker? Are they maybe somebody that needs more time to process information? What are their abilities, their fragilities, their appreciations, their improvements, their communication strategies, their personal and professional intentions, to create these, what he calls PMOs for each person on their team, so that everybody's kind of getting a brief operating manual before they collaborate with somebody, and they get a little bit of an insight of how this person works and functions. And I have different feelings about it. Of like, one thing, I think it's really great because you can help you orient, but also I feel like it can lead to assumptions really fast without us maybe being as curious, like, oh, Iggy's doing that because she's I'm
a big picture thinker, just suck it up. Yeah,
exactly. And at the same time, it also might create a place of, oh, understanding and acceptance, and let's move on. And maybe that prevents my mind from creating a lot of stories around, why you just said that in our meeting together, and not getting in my head. You mentioned also the words around question, like have curiosity before judgment. And this is so huge, because our human minds are designed, right? We're programmed to judge from a place of survival. However, if we let that wild horse kind of run off, it can create havoc. What are some ways or strategies that you've seen helpful for yourself or for your clients that you've worked with to tap into questions before judgments?
I want to go back for a quick second to your personal operating manual for people. I agree and disagree with you both. I'm a big fan of them, but in terms of how within the scope of your working relationship is like the first step of that. Like, hey, use Slack, don't use email, blah, blah, blah. I worked in an office once where I'm like, do not ever put anything on my desk. Just put it in my little mailbox cubby over there because I will lose my mind. And so if someone put something on my desk, I like just threw it in the trash. But I didn't, I mean, I wanted to every time. It just irritated me. So knowing how people communicate helps. I think there's something to be said for how people think and their habits, their default habits. And I think there's a way to avoid the stereotyping, like, oh, you're one of those people, and now I can treat you like that. You know, it has to be done with sensitivity, I think, a little bit. And I would add to your list, knowing how to appreciate the people you work with is going to build those relationships faster and stronger. How to appreciate them and how to play with them. If you don't know those pieces of your coworkers, you're missing so much of who they are as people and how you will work together best over time. So 2 points for that.
I love that, adding to that list. And this is from Mike Michalowicz, so it's not even my list, but I think those are huge pieces to have insight around of how can you play and how can you appreciate your coworkers or your people.
Yeah, exactly. And I facilitate conversations like that with co-leaders often, or small leadership teams that are like super tightly driven because they're like, we produce. I'm like, you're also humans. Like, you're also people. How do you want to work together best? Are you irritated every day when your boss is texting you, or do you need to get, whatever it is? So that was one thing. I forget the other thing your actual question was something else.
Circling back to the question was, how do we practice tapping into more curiosity and asking questions instead of judgments in the workplace or in just even our personal lives?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a place. I was reading a conflict management procedure from an organization recently. As part of the work I do, I get to see what they think should be happening. They're like, you need to be rational all the time. I'm like, you are not going to be rational all the time. Like, that is, to assume that people can approach these situations from rationality is asking a lot that's not realistic. Mainly because we have emotional responses. Most of us respond emotionally first to things. And that's, is this okay or not okay? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Do I need to flee? Do I need, what do I need to do here? So embracing that emotional response and taking some time to process the data from that emotion is like, it sounds like rationalizing emotion, but I think that's still information for us. That's still a data point. Like, oh, this made me frustrated. This made me angry. Some of my work just is really around naming our emotions accurately. If you ask people, this is another beautiful Brene Brown quote, where she's like, you survey all the people, they'll say they're happy, sad, or angry. If you ask them how they feel, 90% of the time. And in reality, there's so many more fine lines and so many more detailed emotional responses, which are all fine. They're all great. And when you're engaged in that emotional response, so there's a point of like, I'm feeling the thing. Wait, now I need to step back and like think about what I'm feeling a little bit and like name that so I can work with it and get the information from that. Then I can go into like, okay, what about the situation made me, it spurred this feeling in me. I think that made me feel that way is also putting the locus of control on the other person, but to bring the locus of control back to yourself is to be able to say, this thing happened. Here's my emotional reaction. I'm aware of my emotional reaction. I can name it. I can figure it out. I can work with it. Now I can go back to the situation and be curious about what in this situation was actually happening, or what did I see happening? Am I accurate? And some of it's like that simple language of like, here's what I saw. Did you see that? Versus, why did you do that? You dummy. Like the you dummy is often silent, but like pretty clear in the tone or in the attitude or in the, presentation of people. So to take the time, process your side first. It doesn't have to take I think people wait too long. So this is like, yeah, process yourself, get yourself ready. Yes. If it's been 17 years and you're like, that thing that happened, and you're like, whoa, that's maybe a big thing. It takes some time, but the reality is we usually wait too long in the workplace, in these sort of day-to-day daily life things. And we feel like we need to be comfortable before we take action. And I would say your comfort is actually not useful in this situation. If you are comfortable, that's great. Like, you may be a person who's like, oh yeah, this happens all the time. I know what to do. I'm familiar with this person, the situation, blah, 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 ready to go with this conflict. Most of folks are uncomfortable, so they wait until they think they will get more comfortable over time, and they don't. So once you've got your emotions under somehow processed in your brain a little bit, then I think you can move to like, well, this is my story. What's your story for this thing? And to try to understand what was the other person seeing, but also what was the other person feeling, which I think is this deeper level of emotional intelligence. Like, I know what I'm feeling. I think you're feeling, like, we often say the other person is just mean, right? Like, oh, they did that thing because they were mean. They wanted to be mean to me because they don't like me. Maybe. I mean, yes, and most likely not, though. However, that is like a classic story we tell ourselves when we try to describe why someone else's behavior wasn't what we wanted or wasn't what we expected, wasn't, is problematic in whatever way. So what was actually going on for that person, thinking, feeling? What did they think was happening? What do they think about themselves as a person through this behavior? What do they, what's going on for them? I think once we get ourselves sort of in a space of like, okay, I know what's going on for me, then I can be more curious for what was going on for you in that same time. And I mean, I'm sure this has happened to both of us 100,000 times where you're like, oh, that's such a big deal. And you go and talk to the person. They're like, what? Like, I said that? I didn't mean it. Oh, sorry. I guess I don't even know that is what happened. Like, oh, I didn't realize that was even a thing. Meanwhile, we're over here like cogitating on it for 6 years. I'm like, not 6 years, but far too long. And our rumination becomes the problem more than the actual situation that happened.
Okay, I want to slow something down that you just shared, because I think there's a lot of juiciness here that, like, how do we discern? Because after something, a rupture happens, it's usually very emotional, or I'll say emotional. People can put the very if they feel.
Everyone says very is fine. It's fine. It's like reality. Yeah.
I get very emotional. I know I'm a very emotional person. But when that happens, and I need some time and space to reflect, right? I need to understand, as you mentioned, like what's happening for me in my experience, to label my feelings, to get some orientation. How do I discern how much time is quote unquote wise? Because you said like you don't want to stay in the comfort zone too long. So how much time is wise to like give myself that sense of space and curiosity to understand what I'm feeling and thinking, and what actually becomes maybe like unhelpful, unskillful, that then is keeping me in maybe the rumination loop, or the place where I'm not moving forward to offer some sort of repair or reconciliation?
Oh, generally, I'd say as short amount of time as possible. And knowing that you're going to have to embrace discomfort to have this conversation with the person, knowing that you're going to have to embrace, like, not like you might have some remnants of those feelings. When we think about our feelings, we sometimes reactivate those feelings in ourselves. Yeah, that's going to happen. Remember that thing that was super frustrating? Cool. Now you're super frustrated again. You're welcome. Like, this is going to happen. So I think knowing those things, but I think the other thing that once you can get clear on what your sort of goal is, it's time to start to have that conversation. Like, is my goal to fix this relationship? Is my goal to manage this relationship so that this person doesn't slow me down anymore and gets out of my way? Is my goal to enact one of my personal values that I felt like, oh, this compromised my integrity, for example, if that was a personal value that was meaningful to me? What is like sort of that underlying goal piece? Once you're clear on that again, in terms of this situation, like, oh, you know what? Like, my need for freedom was really squished here. I need to interact with this person in a way that they know that my need for freedom is important, and that their behavior feels micromanaging to me, and then I can't do my work, and everything's frustrating and terrible. So once you're clear on your values, your goals, your sort of, I don't want to say the outcome you want, because that's where we sort of get too tight in terms of how we approach a conflict. Like, oh, I need this person to apologize. I need them to pay me $400, and I need them to like never wink at me again. Like, okay, like super specific and weird, but fine. I think the reality is I need to repair relationship with this person. I need to build trust, or I need to build respect. Like, once we can get to an articulation of that, usually I would say in terms of our personal values, like I need them to respect my boundary for when I'll communicate with them, and not if they get mad and yell at me because I didn't text them back after 9 p.m. for a work thing, that's not cool. Like this is like a conversation we need to have about my boundary and to respect that, or my freedom to respect that. And so that can come from a place of your needs being met or your values being enacted. And I think once you're clear on either of those, it's time to have that conversation, which is a lot sooner than you think, because you're like, cool, I know what my values are, but I'm not comfortable yet. Cool, embrace the discomfort. That's okay. Your values or your needs are going to ground that conversation in a place that is not as quick to devolve into that emotional state again, which can be unproductive or counterproductive.
I love that you just shared that, like, embrace the discomfort. So you know you're heading into an uncomfortable, especially if you have some people pleasing tendencies or you don't like conflict or conflict avoidant, right? Like if we are even coming into a situation where we know it's going to be maybe extra uncomfortable.
Everyone is conflict avoidant except for sociopaths, and they have been trained to say they're conflict avoidant to fit into society. So everyone will tell you they're conflict avoidant, FYI.
Okay,
Carry
great.
on.
So maybe
that's all of us.
Yeah,
you're normal. You're normal.
So let's accept our wholeness, right?
Yes.
We are all conflict avoidant to some extent, and yeah, it's uncomfortable. And so can we embrace that? And then I love that you emphasized we can kind of take the emotional reactivity that we might feel from thinking about the event or that rupture or those emotions that were spurred in the moment, by grounding into our values and thinking about our goals, can kind of take some of the bite out of it, or some of the flighty, windy intensity, stormy energy. I think is really a helpful frame here. I'm curious, is there ever an instance where repair is just not going to happen?
Oh yeah, the other person's dead. It's not going to happen. They've literally, you had a super bad situation. I hear this more in sort of family relationships where you have a long relationship with someone. That relationship has been very damaged, and the other person literally has died or passed away. Like, cool. That repair conversation is literally never going to happen. Then what, right? How do we move forward? How do we engage with ourselves? And I think there is a lot to be said for folks that specifically practice in terms of grief and what grief means, and like that loss of humans. So I defer. There's a lot of expertise out there that is not my field specifically, but the reality is that repair is not going to happen. And I think there are other situations where you're like, this harm was too big. I don't want to fix this relationship with this person because it was too big. Like, whatever the thing was, like sometimes around violence or around larger actions. So you're like, I can, I think it's very popular in movies to be like, I'll never forgive you. Like, yeah, cool. Like that, there's a cinema, like story part of that, but I think there's a reality side too. That's like, you don't actually have to forgive people, by the way. Like, it's okay to not forgive people, nor do you have to repair a relationship with people, nor like, you don't have to actually do these things. But the work then becomes on you to be like, well, okay, how do I then, for some of these things, if it's a bigger situation, how do I move forward? How do I incorporate this? How do I process this behavior? How do I process this deep lack of trust, for example, with one person, and not let that bleed or spill into my other parts of my life? And again, there are literal therapeutic professionals that will, help people move through specific trauma. I don't want to speak for this entire field that is super valuable and useful, but the reality is we can't always do repair, and maybe we shouldn't always do repair, to be honest. And not everyone deserves to be in your life. Is like the end of the day, that story is true. Or in your organization, like you do have to fire people from your work, kick people out of your, organization. And I think there's this time and space to kick people out of your life too. Like they may not be serving you. The relationship may not be able to be repaired. The trust may be so damaged that you're like, come back in 20 years and maybe we'll talk. But right now, this is not even what I want to put my energy into in terms of like repairing with you as a human being in this space. That's all okay. It's okay to have those limits and those boundaries. I think the reality is we can't always cut people off and never see them again. Like that's not a reality in our personal lives. Like maybe in our work world, we're like, they're fired, they're out of here, and you're like, okay, like that's pretty definitive. Like they're not doing this job anymore. But in our personal lives, people are like, you can fire your friends, like whatever. It's hard to fire your family. Like that is very complicated, obviously, for people. But the reality is we can move to manage those relationships in ways that prevent future conflict. I'm sure we've both spoken to many people who are like, oh yeah, I haven't talked to my brother, my dad, my cousin for 10 years. And you're like, okay, they're still your family member, but like they don't have a speaking relationship, or like I only text with them, I don't call them, I don't go visit them anymore. Whatever it is, like people have put these limits in their lives, specifically I think around family friend kind of relationships. Like, oh yeah, I don't hang out with them anymore. Like that is a thing. I think there's a space to have that conversation, and I am always biased toward learning and growth. Like there's a space to have a conversation to get the most learning you can from that situation and to maybe help that other person learn and grow potentially. But at the end of the day, it might not be your job, might not be in your will to do. Cool. Don't do it. And it's easier said than done to be like, I wrote them off. And like, did you? Like, okay, maybe. But maybe not. Maybe you're just trying to give yourself more time and space to have that conversation. Maybe you're just devolving into rumination that's not useful for that conflict and that, that repair that you, even the engaging in the possibility of repair is sometimes more repairing than doing nothing, even if you can't get to this beautiful conclusion. Like the accept non-closure at the end is really another real part that it might not turn out all rainbows and butterflies at the end, but if you don't try, sometimes that is the part that people regret the most.
Yeah, what's coming up for me as you're sharing is thinking about how I also can have this tendency as somebody who's very controlling to want to like control the repair process or control the timing of it. And just so it was helpful to hear you share that of like sometimes like a relationship is not worth repairing, or it's going to happen on a different timeline than you want it to, or it's just going to flow in a different direction. And how can, we meet that with the like personal responsibility to keep showing up and doing the work, and also recognize like there's a lot that we can't control.
There's a lot we can't control, and it's super hard to have a conversation and facilitate a conversation at the same time with another person who may or may not be ready, prepared, on the same wavelength. You know what I'm saying? To have that conversation. And that is, I mean, there are many mediators, facilitators, folks out there that really just work on personal conflict level, which is beautiful and fascinating. And I think we underestimate the work it takes to sometimes manage ourselves, but also cue the other person to manage themselves while we have a conversation together. There are just these different layers we sometimes have to operate at. Like, I'm not ruminating. Cool, now they're ruminating. Hold on. Now, like, I'm in an emotional reaction space. Wait, now they are. And, like, to sort of talk people through. And I think this is where those, like, step-by-step guides are actually pretty helpful, because depending on which one you like or how you want to look at things, you can be like, cool, we're going to talk. Like, it takes away the facilitation side of some of those conversations. If we're like, we're going to talk about these 5 things, I'm just going to let you know, here they are. Here's how it's going to flow. You can answer first, and then I'll answer, and then we'll keep going. And so it's kind of takes the management of the conversation out of the conversation, which is another layer of complication. I think that gets added in at times and can be tricky.
Yeah, for sure. Oof, there is so much here that we could keep diving deeper and deeper into. I so appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your insights with us, Iggy. Where can people learn more about you and stay connected to your work?
I'm over at wslleadership.com, which stands for Work, Sport, Life, Leadership. I have a newsletter there that talks a lot about leadership, and really conflict in leadership is actually a theme that is, who knew, present in all of our lives. And resources, things like that, and contacting me, folks can figure that out there too. So yeah, just wslleadership.com is the easiest way for people to get a snapshot of what's going on and how to connect.
Thanks so much for listening to the Centered in the City podcast. I welcome you to pause and take a moment to just tune into your body. Notice what you might be feeling as we just discussed conflict management, conflict resolution, restorative justice for the last 40 minutes. Maybe notice any sensations. Is there tightness or tingling or opening or expansion, places of warmth, coolness? And then maybe notice if your mind wandered to any places in your life where there's some rub, maybe some conflict internally, externally with coworkers, family members, neighbors. And I welcome you to think about what's one takeaway that you're gaining from this week's conversation with Iggy that gives you some insight in how you might want to take a baby step towards repair. So maybe that could just be take some time to sit with yourself to notice what are your own thoughts and feelings and needs from the situation. Maybe you're ready to engage and want to reach out to set up a conversation. Maybe you notice this conflict feels bigger than you and you need to reach out for some external support. Maybe it's practicing some more curiosity with self or others to explore what's really happening here. Maybe it's even just acknowledging your own value system and how you can live in alignment with your own values. Whatever comes to your heart and mind, trusting that place of wisdom and intuition. And feel free to reach out to me on social media, on Instagram @OneWade, or even through the contact form in the show notes, and celebrate what you are learning, what dots are connecting, and even what action you are forwarding in your own life. May all of the work that we do here at Centered in the City, whether you're a member inside the Centered City platform or whether you're a podcast listener or both, may it continue to support us all, being just even 10% more centered in our lives. Thank you for being here as always and letting me and my guests into your hearts, your minds, your ears. And until next time, stay centered.